Alrighty, welcome back for part 2 of the 351 Windsor swap in my 1973 Mustang. If you haven't already seen part 1, I do highly recommend watching that first part as we pull the original 302 and T5 transmission out of the car to make room for the new and improved 351 Windsor. In this video, we're going to see why this motor ended up needing a full teardown to the block, and after that, we will not only be getting this motor drop-in ready for the Mustang, but also making some performance improvements while we're at it. Let's get right into it. Well, starting things off here, we need to actually tear down the motor. So that starts with the easy parts and stuff that's in the way of, well, bigger stuff. So we got spark plug wires on either side, pretty easy to get to. After that, we can start pulling brackets off the front so that we can actually get this intake manifold. Power steering bracket comes off pretty easy since we never got a power steering pump to begin with on this motor. And the alternator comes off with no real hassle after that. Since we're here, might as well get the water pump pulley off and pull the alternator bracket off behind that. With the water pump now being exposed, we can start pulling hoses off that would normally be for the heater core and water pump bypass. Pretty easy to get out of the way, and then after that we can actually pull the water pump off itself. The exhaust manifolds are not needed at this point, so we're going to focus on removing those. After unbolting the EGR from the intake, we now have the ability to remove the lower exhaust from the manifold and then the manifold itself. The other side is a bit easier without the EGR, but it's pretty much the same process, and either way, it's removed and out of the way. Finally, we can start getting at this intake and remove most of the bulk on this motor. These EFI intakes come in two pieces with a lower and an upper manifold, which makes the job pretty easy in theory, except for the fact that the center bolt on this upper manifold is not a normal bolt, and no matter the attempts of my hammer or the torch, this bolt would not come out, and it even managed to bend the teeth on my snap-on bit to the point where I couldn't even use it anymore. Fortunately, Snap-on being Snap-on warranted that with no question, but at this point the only option is to take the intake off as a whole with the upper and lower connected, which is not a fun job to say the least. Starting off, I vacuumed up what dirt I could and removed the coil and the components surrounding it. Once that was out of the way, I could start removing all of the exposed wiring harness so I could get access to the lower intake manifold bolts. I decided to remove the throttle body here just so I had as much room as I could to pull this thing out. I then got to play the fun game of guessing what random socket extensions would work to be able to get the bolts off on what we'll call the worst side of the lower manifold. But after about an hour, I was finally able to pull this manifold off and see our first look into the internals of this motor. Alrighty, well, Big Mama here, and taking a look at the value of this thing, well, I mean, it ain't horrible, but it ain't pretty either. I have a feeling once we pull these valve covers, they're going to tell the complete story here. The smell also told part of the story. But let's just say there might have been one or two, we'll call them extended oil changes to say the least. Anyway, let's pop the cover and see what we got. And yeah, pretty much what we expected to see. It's a good thing we're not using these cylinder heads because the smell alone seems like it would be robbing horsepower. Not actually, but not a great sign right off the bat, and we kind of got a good idea what the bottom end is going to be looking like. Pulling the second cover looks surprisingly better, but not by much. Either way, we need to pop these heads and see what's going on further down. Pulling the drain plug and watching the oil, fortunately doesn't show anything bad, which was expected given that this was a known running motor. Looking closer at the plug itself, we don't see any obvious shimmer or chocolate milkshake, so we're in the green there at least. But now we can actually move on to pulling these heads off. Taking a look at the push rods, they still have a shiny finish, so nothing to note here, and we'll actually be reusing these later after cleaning them very thoroughly. Pulling the head shows us a bit more of the story, and honestly, doesn't look horrible. Bit worn out, but I'd say usable. There's a bit of a shine / polish to the bores, but the crotch shaft is still somewhat visible, and we got a pretty decent ridge going on too at the top of the bore. The original plan for this motor was not to screw with the bottom end too much if it's not needed, so I had no intention of changing out these rings or anything. They look pretty much married to those bores, and I'm not a divorce lawyer. Similar story for the other side, nothing catastrophic, so let's move on to the bottom end. After pulling the pan off and the oil filter, we get a nice look at what we're dealing with on the bottom end. We do have quite the oil varnish going on pretty much all around, so our oil might get black a bit quicker than normal, but can't say it's really going to harm anything in the process. We're definitely going to be replacing this oil pump since we're here, along with this pretty nasty oil pan with some nice sludge going on the bottom. Plus we need a front sump pan anyway, so this pan is unusable regardless. We do need to get the timing cover off since we're going to be running a mechanical fuel pump anyway, and the EFI covers have no provision for a mechanical fuel pump, so it's not like we can use that anyway. We take the crank pulley off first, along with the balancer afterwards with our puller, which then allows us to take off the front cover and get a good look at the condition of this chain. And yeah, good thing we went in here because this chain is just looking great. Lots of play as you can see, so we'll be replacing this for sure. It is interesting to note though that this is a double roller, what seems to be from the factory. I couldn't find any information on this online, so I have to assume that this was not put in by someone else, which is pretty neat that Ford did this if that's the case. Another very interesting detail is that even though this is an EFI motor, Ford still put the mechanical fuel pump provision on the cam nut. So I would have to assume that this was due to some sort of torque figure that they didn't want to change or balance for the camshaft. I'm not totally sure, but it's still interesting that it's here and basically unused for its original purpose. At this point in time, I did need to put the motor up on a hoist so I could pull the flex plate. We're not going to be needing that anyway, and might as well be throwing in the garbage because you won't see me driving anything but a stick. But something I was very curious to know was what the bottom end bearings look like. I wasn't too hopeful based on what I had seen beforehand, but I thought maybe, just maybe, there might have been, and yeah, I don't know what I was thinking. These bearings are pretty much shot and on their way out, so yeah, we got to pull the whole bottom end and get these replaced. So the rod bearings themselves actually don't look horrible, but either way, we got to pull everything, so might as well replace them while we're here. With all the rods and pistons out of the way, we can finally start pulling the main caps and then the crank afterwards. But even pulling the thrust main in the center, which shout out to Ford for actually putting it in the center rather than one of the end caps, we can see that this whole thing is pretty much copper coated at this point, so this motor was on borrowed time to begin with. But after pulling all those, we can pull the crank out and begin cleaning up what we safely can without disturbing the bottom end too much. Again, without disturbing the bottom end too much, I did simply want to clean up the bores while I'm here. I used a combination of WD-40, steel wool, and Scotch-Brite, but I do want to preface that anytime you're using steel wool, especially for the bottom end here, you do want to be incredibly careful not to leave any shavings behind, as they can embed themselves into the bore. I did do a lot of cleaning off camera, but after I was happy with what I had, it was time to take our ratchets and flip the switch because we need to build this motor back up now. First thing we need to do is install the new main bearings. I forget if I use Clevites or Kings. Either brand is pretty good from what I hear. The main point I want to make is that anything when it comes to internals, I'm typically not one to cheap out, so I pay for some pretty decent bottom end bearings. That's both for the mains and the rods. As for lubrication, I'm using motor oil for the whole build. Assembly lube is preferred, but I was just using what I had available at the time. I'm going to tap the crank on either side to seat it and then move on to checking the main bearing clearances. Make sure once again that everything is as clean as possible. I'm going to lay down plastic gauge on every single main bearing and torque all main caps to spec. After taking off all the mains and checking the final result, you can see we're right around 0.0015, which is on the tighter side, but totally within the acceptable range, and we're just going to see some higher oil pressures because of that. But once that's checked out, and I retorque everything, I'm going to turn the crank and make sure that everything spins smoothly. At this point, we can start moving on to the rods and getting their new bearings in place, and ensure that all these check out properly as well. Once more, clean is the name of the game, and after placing the upper bearing in place and getting a nice film of oil on that, we can go ahead and take out our ring compressor and start punching these pistons into the crank. After getting to the rod cap side, we're specifically not going to oil this side because we need to check the clearances on the rods first. So we're going to again lay down some plastic gauge and check the same thing after torquing down this rod cap. Taking a look, we can see we're right in between 0.002 and 0.003, call it 0.0025, which again is fine for what we're doing. After getting all the other pistons and rods in place, we're then going to give ourselves a sanity check and make sure that everything spins over fine. I'm checking here for any disturbances while spinning it over, just making sure it's a very fluid motion with no hiccups in between. After taking a roll lock disc to the deck to clean it up, we now have to check that the deck is flat, which may or may not have been overlooked while at this stage, so well, there we go. Looks flat to me. Let's move on to pulling parts off the old motor. What I'm doing here requires a little bit of context. The heads that I was planning to run were Ford's SVO aluminum heads, which are essentially GT40 heads made out of aluminum with larger valves, so they're pretty decent heads for what they are. But there was tons of conflicting information online as to whether or not you could run these between the 289/302 platform as well as the 351 Windsor platform, since the 351 uses larger head bolts. A lot of people said this wouldn't work, but Ford's official information sheet on this said that it will work. And what do you know, the 351 head bolt slides right in, so we're pretty much good to go here. For the clutch and flywheel setup, as previously mentioned, we can reuse the flywheel since the 351 Windsor shares the same 28-ounce counterbalance as the early 302s, so we're good there. And the clutch itself is fairly new anyway, with less than a few thousand on it, so no reason to be replacing it just yet. Granted, our 351 is going to be pushing not only more power, but a lot more torque than the 302, since that's what these motors were originally built for. So we're already exceeding what this clutch is rated for, so down the line, if it ends up not being able to hold up to what you need, it's not such a bad job to replace it if needed. The flywheel uses red Loctite on all of its bolts, so we use a torch here to pull it off, and then the threads and bolts will need to be cleaned off before being reused. After dropping the flywheel, the separator plate comes off the dowels pretty easy. Next up, since we're running a mechanical fuel pump for this build, and we need the heads anyway, we need the timing cover off this 302 since they are interchangeable between the two motors. After pulling the distributor out, the intake on this motor is a lot easier than the 351 to say the least. Once that's out, it's the same process to pull the heads off, which, as you might be able to tell, whatever motor these heads came off of was taken a whole lot better care of than our 351. Also, to briefly add some context to the 302 we're looking at right now and pulling all these parts off of, this is not the original 302 that was in the car. That motor actually ran very well, but it was very underpowered and low compression. So I had this high compression 302 laying around that I knew nothing about, but it looked alright on the inside, so I decided to throw it in, and it bent a rod about 3 miles down the road. So it seemed like a good time for the 351 regardless. After pulling the fuel pump out, we now have access to get this cast iron water pump off this motor, which I do need to note that there are some complications in water pumps since we're using a timing cover that would normally use a clockwise rotation water pump, but with a serpentine setup that wants a counterclockwise rotation water pump. The situation will be fully covered in the next video when we do install the motor, because it does lead to some issues down the line, but we do end up getting them resolved anyway. Pulling out the dipstick is pretty straightforward, and we do need to keep this one because we will be reusing it for our front sump timing cover setup. But at this point, we're in the clear to pull this timing cover off and also get access to the chain. Though this chain is probably okay since it doesn't really have any play to it, we're still going to use a new timing chain just to be on the safe side. What we're more interested in is the fuel pump eccentric, as this one is a much cleaner example than the one we found in our 351. Moving back over to the 351, we can really start getting this thing together now. Starting off with our brand new timing chain, we're going to put the lower crank gear on after heating it up generously with a torch so it slides on the keyway a lot easier. After oiling up the chain, we can get it on the cam gear and then get it in place. The fuel pump eccentric is part of the setup, so we do need to get this on right now. And after making sure that our timing dots do line up, we can torque this down and get it in place. I'm also going to install the oil slinger on the crank snout, and the oil slinger itself is an interesting piece only because I'm still sort of unsure if it is needed. I believe the idea was to sling oil away from the front main seal on these older motors back in the day, just due to the technology that they had with seals not being as great as they are today. But since I'm running this older style front timing cover and seal, it doesn't really hurt anything, and there's probably a reason that the newer style covers have gone away with this, but I decided to run it anyway. Figured now would be a decent time to install the new oil pump, which is a Mellings unit, so I feel a bit better knowing that there's a high quality oil pump on the bottom end. I'm dipping the end in a pool of oil and then spinning it with the drive shaft between the distributor and the oil pump to prime the oil pump until I see oil spilling out of it. After that, we can go ahead and install it, as well as take our new front sump pickup tube and generously use brake cleaner to clean this thing out thoroughly. Then simply install it with its gasket on the oil pump. One small thing to note is do not forget the drive shaft in the oil pump, or the distributor won't actually be spinning your oil pump when the motor's running. At this point, we're going to go ahead and put our pan on so we can get this motor painted. I scuffed the outside of the block the best I could and sealed off anything I did not want getting overspray on. The trick I used is to roll some sort of very solid rolling object like a steel rod or input shaft to get a very clean edge of the tape around the motor. But once we got all of that, I went to O'Reilly's and picked out the first blue that I saw, said looks good, and put a few layers on. And you know what? I don't think it turned out all that bad. Prepping the timing cover is up next, which is just a matter of scraping off the old gasket, but also replacing this front main seal. This one looked alright, but I knew it was very old, so I went ahead and replaced it just to be sure. I will say though, this is not a fun seal to get off. On the later timing covers, they switched this seal to be on the outside of the timing cover, but on these early ones, it's on the inside, so if you ever need to replace this while it's in the vehicle, it is a job for sure. This took a lot of trial and error to get out. I'm sure that Ford had some special tool that they used to get this out, but I ended up using this tap to push it out eventually with my press. Once that's in, we can go ahead and get our timing cover gasket ready and put the timing cover on. I did forget to show here, but a very important thing to note is not to tighten this down very hard initially. Because this is an older style timing cover, we have no dowels to help guide this thing on. So we do need to use the front balancer to center the timing cover in place to make sure that this front seal does not leak over time. As previously mentioned, we will go over the water pump situation a lot more in depth in the next video, but for right now, we went ahead and replaced the inner gasket for this pump as it was pretty nasty. Next up, we went through and repainted pretty much every accessory bracket on this motor, silver being the primary color to match the heads and intake, along with the secondary color being black for the pulleys. We want to get the pan on now so we can wrap up the bottom end completely, but before we do that, we do need to check that the oil pan pickup is the correct clearance to the pan. Normally, you would use clay, but I don't have that, so I use tinfoil, and it actually works pretty well since it keeps its shape good enough for what we're doing. I'm going to place a piece on the pickup and then put a few bolts in the pan to torque it down, along with the pan rail gaskets to fully simulate what this would be like. After that, I got my calipers out, and we're reading just over 1/4 inch on the reading, which is pretty much right where we want to be in the clearance, and we're good to go here. After that, we can put the pan on for real this time, with lots of RTV in place since we're using this 4-piece pan gasket. Next time I do any sort of build, I'll probably use the 1-piece gasket that they sell, but this works for right now. Moving on to the cylinder heads, after spending a lot of time cleaning all 4 surfaces on both of these heads, we actually do have a machinist straight edge handy and we can check the clearances on these. I have my feeler set to .002, and so if it passes here, we're pretty much good to go. So after checking a bunch of different locations on both heads, we pass with flying colors, so we can go ahead and throw these heads on the block. I went ahead and oiled up the cylinders one last time while we were here, and then set our head gasket down on the block dowels. If you don't have these block dowels, I highly recommend buying them and installing them because they're cheap and pretty easy to install for a lot of mental reassurance that your heads are good to go. As previously mentioned, we're going to go ahead and reuse these push rods since the push rod lengths are different between the 302 and 351s. I'm making sure to use a lot of brake cleaner, and I ended up using a brush to clean these off for the most part. I am also keeping track of which side goes to the rocker and which side goes to the lifter to keep the valve train as happy as we can, given that we're changing heads, rockers, but then we're keeping the push rods and lifters the same. After installing the heads and the valve train on both sides, we're going to generously oil as much as we can up here on the top end, and then go through the somewhat tedious task of torquing down the rockers. These aren't adjustable rockers, so our life is actually a bit easier here. What you're looking at here is one of Amazon's finest, a dual plane 351 Windsor manifold that is probably from China, but I looked around and this thing actually looks pretty decent and really didn't have any issues with it. Keeping clean in the loop though, I am taking compressed air and going through every port and hole in this thing, as well as cleaning out the intake gaskets before we install this manifold. We are going to gently install the intake manifold gaskets in place, and then take some RTV and go around each of the 4 corners with some RTV around the water ports. With that out of the way, Now what we do, in my opinion, is probably one of the goofiest small block Ford building techniques that I've seen. And that's, instead of using the gaskets that come from the kit to put on the channel walls, we use a very thick layer of RTV to basically make our own gasket. I can't say I agree with this, but pretty much every build I see online seems to do the same method. And I mean, it does work, I guess, so we're just going to go with it here. I will say when doing this though, you don't want to try and smooth over the edge after you put the manifold down. Just leave it alone and let it dry as is. After torquing down the intake manifold, we can really get to making the top end of this thing look pretty nice by installing our valve covers. These are actually temporary valve covers as we get some high-rise ones coming in the mail, but these will do the trick for now. So since we got this 351 out of the truck chassis, these are normally rear sump pans and therefore have their dipstick tube in the center. Ford being Ford, decided to just put the hole for the stick in the block itself rather than in the pan, so now we have to deal with this hole that is just open to the elements. What I ended up coming up with was taking the original dipstick, cleaning it out thoroughly, and cutting it short to where we could basically make a plug out of it for this dipstick hole. I put some RTV on the end of it and squished it down in my vise so there was no way oil was going to penetrate through this. We then installed it with some RTV into the motor itself to make sure it doesn't leak, but given that the stick was originally meant for this spot anyway and not designed to leak, we're probably in the clear. At this point, we're pretty much just cleaning up the top end with some odds and ends. The first being the thermostat and thermostat housing, which is pretty straightforward. Then we have our water port for the heater core, along with the fitting for our water temp gauge, both of which get tape on them to prevent any leakage over time. On the back of this intake, we have two more water ports that we can pull from, as well as a vacuum port, but we're simply going to plug these for right now. For the oil sending port, we are going to pre-install part of the adapter, as this spot is a major pain in the butt to get at when everything is already in place and the motor's in the car. Again, Ford being Ford made this the only spot you can pull oil pressure from externally. But since we're here, we might as well also install the fuel pump we pulled off the old motor, making sure to oil up the lever before installing it. Fortunately, we are approaching the home stretch here. We need to start getting these accessories on, and so starting with the power steering pump bracket, we are already running into issues. Since these are late 90s heads, they have an EGR crossover in the heads, and in Ford's great wisdom, they decided let's just make massive bolts to fit these holes instead of coming up with a real solution. So now I need to hog out these accessory brackets to be able to fit these massive bolts in here. But once all that drilling is done and our brackets are on, we can start getting all the pulleys on the setup. Starting with our water pump pulley, and then we can move on to the crank pulley beneath it. Since we are using a serpentine setup, we do need to be very cautious in how we align everything, as the serpentine can be a bit more picky than a V-belt to say the least, and it will squeal if they are installed incorrectly. The power steering pump is a bit of a unique situation because we did not get one to begin with. Granted, I'm not sure I would have trusted the original one anyway, as Ford power steering pumps tend to be very whiny to begin with, so I bought a new reman unit. Of course, this wouldn't come with the pulley itself, that would be silly, so I needed to order that separate. But we can go ahead and install the power steering pump onto our brackets, and then use totally random bolts that I found in my junk bolt drawer, because why would they provide me with the bolts to begin with? That's obviously asking too much. So then we can tighten the pulley onto the pump afterwards. The alternator has a much easier setup for getting a pulley on. I'm sure there is a reason, but I don't totally understand why the power steering pump has a press-on pulley, while this one is simply a bolt-on pulley, but whatever. I wanted to keep my electrical system the same on my car, so I went with a 1G 70 amp alternator instead of doing the 3G conversion. And since those normally come in a V-belt setup, we do need to switch the pulleys around. And rare shout out to Ford for keeping pretty much everything identical between the 2G and the 1G alternator, so it made the swap super easy. Alright, we can see the light at the end of the tunnel. Simply checking our clearances with a large square to see how aligned all of our pulleys are. Which the alternator, probably because we swapped around these pulleys, actually needed about an 1/8 inch spacer to line everything up. But, ladies and gentlemen, we got ourselves a V8 motor, as Jeremy Clarkson would say. And I know, there's some nice looking motors out there, but you know what? This one don't look half bad. And we'll see how far the efforts actually take us in the next video, where we get this in the Mustang and see if we can get it running. But stay tuned for that, and thank you so much for watching.